You can find trees and hierarchies in many different domains. They can represent a lot of different concepts and ideas. For example, we find trees in family trees, organizational hierarchies, how organizations are built, what are the lines, um, the chains of reporting, the chains of orders, for example. File systems are hierarchical, with directories and subdirectories and so on and so on, documents, structures, subsections, paragraphs, and so on. Phylogenetic trees, which are these trees that represent species, how they evolve, how similar they are, which groups of animals are more similar or belong to the same family, and these kind of things. Um, we can also find trees in processes, sub-processes. There's a bit of a temporal component here, which we're going to look into in some of the later slides. Political entities, anything that is bodies, organizations, and so on, as well as taxonomies. Um, so what is a tree? How can we describe a tree in very simple terms? A tree is really um, relationships between parent-child relationships between nodes of this tree. You could say it's like a graph. It's like a network, but without cycles. So there's only a single path between any two nodes. We also have a root node in this network. This is a node that has no parents, and we have leaf nodes. Those are uh, nodes that don't have children, basically. Furthermore, in such a tree, this is a bit of technical terminology here, but um, further in such a network, in such a tree, we can talk about the depth. So the depth of a tree is the number of levels or the number of parents between nodes and leaves. So the longer these chains from the root to the leaves are, the deeper the tree is. And similar, we can also talk about the breadth of a tree. The breadth is the number of siblings that you have in each level. So in this case, our breadth is just 2 and the depth is 4 for this tree. So again, broader trees have more siblings and spread out more. Let's say horizontally, if we stick to this picture, the depth is really the vertical extent of a tree. Now, when we visualize trees, we want to support tasks. That's always super important. That in visualization we talk about tasks we want to support, tasks people may have, um, and so on, which help us in the first place to decide whether we need a visualization to solve these tasks at all, and how can we find a visualization that supports best these specific tasks. So in trees, we can ask questions, we can support tasks about around finding specific nodes, for example, finding the children of a specific node, following chains, figuring out how many nodes we do have, how broad, how breadth our tree is, um, how deep the tree is. In the example on the right, for example, you have this one branch that goes very deep, whereas the tree is fairly broad. Which branches are the largest, for example? Which nodes have more siblings, have more children, and which parents have more siblings, and all these kind of things. Um, and important is also, is this tree balanced? Again, this is related to the branches, how deep certain branches are. Is this a balanced tree? Is this a binary tree? Do we have branches of the tree that have that are deeper, that are more broad, and these kind of questions? So already on the example of the right, you can come up with many different questions. You can see many different visual patterns in this tree. In visualizing trees, in this lecture, we want to go through some high-level categories or high-level techniques that you can use to visualize trees. The first one I want to talk about is the explicit techniques versus implicit techniques. In explicit techniques, shown on the left here in number A, in figure A, um, in explicit tree representations, you show nodes as boxes or points, circles, whatever, and the hierarchical relations between these nodes are shown as lines. So in this example on the left, we have the root node on top, and the tree grows vertically, so to say. So there is an orientation from top to bottom, and we can see that the top is the root nodes, and then we go to the leaves as we go down. Following these lines, we can see which nodes are in a parent-child relationships. Yeah. On the right, we have an implicit relation, which is quite similar in some sense. So nodes are still represented as sort of boxes or more areas, really. But the parent-child relationship is shown through is shown implicitly. This is not explicitly shown by lines connecting these nodes, but here, for example, it's shown by containment. So A is our root node and has the children B, C, D, E. And we see that these are the child nodes because they're inside the larger box. Other techniques that are implicit could be, for example, overlap. So here we show the parent-child relationship between A and its children by having the nodes overlap over the node A. So it gives us a bit more space for A to, for example, show attributes to A or something else. Pictures inside, text, you name it. And we can also do, if we need more space, we can attach these child nodes implicitly to the parent node. So here our relationship is visualized by adjacency. We go into some of these examples in more detail now. Here is the most common representations for trees and hierarchies, the node link diagram. As I already said, this is an explicit relationship, an explicit tree representation. It's well known. It's common representation. It can show many levels. It has a clear hierarchical structure, so to say. So start reading on the top, and then you go down, and you see the more you go down, the longer the branch is. You can see the amount of points here indicate you how many nodes you have per branch and sub-branch and so on and so on. So it's quite good to compare the length, the depth of branches, as well as the breadth of specific branches. However, there's a problem that it is space inefficient. You need a lot of space, as in this example, when you have one branch that stands out. You need a lot of space for this one. You're going to waste, so to say, a lot of screen space, which in this case is filled by legend and my text. Another problem with this node link diagram representation is that nodes are fairly small, specifically when you have a lot of these nodes. So if you want to encode like additional attributes to nodes, if you want to play with the node size, you run into troubles quickly. I mean, to some extent that works, but there's a limit to this. And the other thing is that you kind of using a lot of visual ink, so to say, to show your representations, really. This is not something, this might be something you want to avoid by showing your parent-child relationships implicitly. Now, there's one caveat to this representation, this particular picture, and I want you to be very careful in looking at this picture, because what I said before is a tree is kind of like a graph, but without cycles. We can see in this representation that there are actually cycles. So if you look carefully here, this node has two parents. This node has two children, this one and this one. But this node is also a child of this one. And you have similar relationships here. This is an interesting example where there are actually cycles in a tree that make it more like a graph, but you can still use such a layout. So be careful that such a representation, for example, you can still show if there are cycles, if there are specific relationships between any of the nodes. Nothing, for example, prevents you from linking this node to this node. For example, in an organizational hierarchy, there might be several ways how a specific person in this hierarchy reports. So it might have a specific person might have two line managers, for example. Um, just to conclude these kind of discussion about cycles and trees, this is something that is called directed acyclic or a graph tree is called a directed acyclic graph. If you have cycles, then it could be a directed graph. Um, there's more to learn about networks, but this is another lecture. So let's stick to trees. In trees, again, we have only one parent per child. Another kind of explicit representation, which is quite similar to the node-link diagram that we just discussed, is the dendrogram, or also called phylogram because it's heavily used to represent phylogenetic trees. However, the main point here is that it shows similarities between elements. So in this example, this is a phylogenetic tree that shows how genetically similar specific organisms are. So on the top here we have Homo sapiens, we have the house mouse, and we have cattle. We can see that these ones are in the same branch, which means they're very, very similar. So this tree really results from comparing genetic samples, and if these samples are similar, we cluster these groups together. So it's basically the result of a biclustering. And a biclustering means that each two elements that are similar get the same parent, and this is recursively done. So you see house mouse and cattle are more similar, and once I have this group, this is closest to Homo sapiens, and this group of these three is similar to other vertebrates, and so on and so on and so on. Now, talking about this measure of similarity, there is one more indication in this representation that can tell us about the similarity between two leaves, really, in this tree. And this is the length of these branches. So smaller branches, like here, this one is barely visible, really, between the house mouse and the cattle, means they're very, very similar. This one is a bit longer, so it means these two are more dissimilar. And you can see here that these two entities are very dissimilar because these branches are very, very long, whereas here we have a lot of tiny differences that make up a new species. So you can see from the shape of the tree here, as well as from the length of these branches, how similar certain elements are, certain leaf nodes are. So it's quite an efficient representation if you have these kind of problems. The drawback of this representation, of course, is that you have only two children. You can extend this to more, but then your measure of similarity might not be as meaningful. And the parent nodes in this case are not usually named. So here we have just numbers, but which might indicate some sort of a similarity. But you could imagine labeling them different if you really want. Other than that, I think it's a very clean representation. If you think of this node-link diagram that I've shown before, you can nicely follow these lines from the root node to the leaf nodes, for example. And then here, what is also really nice is these things are grouped again into higher level groups, so you can use this this dimension here, the space, really to indicate groups. So we have vertebrates here, we have invertebrates, plants, and fungi. Now, if your trees have become really, really complex, and you all know this from your file system, from your file browser on your local computer, there's a split interaction technique where you can extend and collapse trees. So you open a folder and you see what's inside, and you close the folder, and it compresses the view of your tree, really. So this is a simple technique. You can always use this in any kind of visualization, of course. Clicking the node removes its children, and clicking the node again opens up the children. Of course, you may want to recalculate the layout a little bit. It will cause some, well, let's say animations or changes in the displays, to keep the tree compact. So you may want to use animation if you're going for such a technique. Okay, so far for explicit representations, the many more explicit representations. Again, this is just an overview over tree representations. Let's look at some implicit relations, some implicit tree representations. The icicle plot is a very common technique for an implicit representation. And implicit representations, remember, the relations are not shown by lines. The parent-child relationships are not shown by lines between nodes as like in node in diagrams, but by adjacency, for example. So in an icicle plot, we have the root node on the top, and it really stretches the top of our tree here. And then we sort of stack its child nodes to the bottom. So we can see this is a branch that has these kind of nodes, and then the branch goes this way, and then here the branch splits into two balanced sub-branches. But up to here, it's a really unbalanced branch. We can also see this is a very unbalanced branch because the nodes on this side of the tree are really, let's say, large, and here they're really small. Now, what is the size encode? Why are some of these nodes longer than others? Well, the most intuitive measure really is the number of children, or the number of leaves, so to say. So here we can see that each leaf node is really shown by a line of pixels. So if we say this is the width of these leaves here, you can see them barely on the bottom is shown by 1 pixel. So you just add up these pixels and then you automatically get to this length. So we can see this node has way more leaves eventually than this one. So this gives us a bit more, a better idea of of how imbalanced certain branches are, um, or let's say the importance of nodes. We can, of course, use in this case color. It's really effective for visualizing additional attributes to nodes. So you can, for example, imagine now that you could have text inside. If you have, for example, a document and you want to show that your document structure, you could now put the header titles here, the title of each chapter, subchapter, subsection, and so on and so on and so on. There's one more interesting thing about icicle plots is a temporal component. So I believe this is a representation from a memory allocation during a process. So if you think of time starts here and goes horizontally to here, so this is the beginning of the process, this is the end of the process, we can see which sub-processes are called during the execution of this one process. So we can see that at this point in time here, there are loads of sub-processes called, which then are wrapped up, and again, a lot of sub-processes and so on. And we see these characteristic in this tree that there are a lot of sub-processes are called, which are then wrapped up gradually. So you can see how long these processes take, and which part of your memory is calling the most sub-processes, the most diversity, the most diverse sub-processes, and so on and so on. One problem, again, with this one is that your leaf nodes become very small. And again, if you look very carefully here, the leaves are not even shown. So if you look at these small triangles here, this is more or less an indication that means something like there is more, which is not shown here. So again, you can imagine interactively clicking on such a sub-branch and then extending it or collapsing it. Now, this problem with these leaves becoming very small is this is a general problem in trees because as you go down in your hierarchy, you expect to have more nodes and eventually more leaves. Now, how do you visualize this on a screen? How do you account for many children, many leaves, without running out of space? There is another representation, an implicit representation, that does this quite efficiently, and these are tree maps. Tree maps are becoming a bit more popular, more commonly used in, for example, in journalism. This is an example of a tree map that shows the types of goods and products that the country is exporting, and these products are grouped by high-level categories. So uh, we have crops here, and plants, rice, coconuts, and so on and so on. Um, so what you see is each of these boxes now is one high-level category, differentiated by a color, and each of these categories is then subdivided into cells, and each cell is a child. So remember um, the small sketch I was showing in the beginning. Here we're representing child-parent relationships through containment. Now, these tree maps are efficient in the sense that they are space filling. I can fill my whole screen and then I just subdivide my screen into these subcells, and I can then again recursively subdivide each cell into more subcells, and I basically use all my screen space to show leaves. Because eventually rice, this leaf rice, is having is using all the space. And what's more is I can even show, I can vary the size of these squares and rectangles to show specific attributes about these nodes. For example, the percentage of export that rice products have in this specific country. And on the bottom left, we have a three-dimensional representation of how we can think about tree maps, of this kind of stacking children on top of their parents, for example, and then looking at it from the top, really. You can also efficiently encode additional variables for each of the nodes in your hierarchy. On the left, we have a tree map that visualizes geographic regions, and that vary in the darkness. And then you can see that certain of these regions are darker, certain are brighter, and so on and so on. Using color, again, you can show a lot of additional information on tree maps. And eventually, here on the left, we have an example where so the same geographic tree map basically is open up, so all the child nodes are opened, so we can see inside. And what we can see is now the constituencies of these higher level regions. We can see how specific attributes are distributed among these sub-constituencies, and so on. It's pretty much similar to a map, really. That's what it's called, a tree map, really. So how do we visualize depth in tree map? Remember, node link diagrams in these explicit representations, we have sort of a vertical extent of the tree, so we can see the branches that are having, the deep branches that are having a lot of children and leaves. They are long, they use a lot of space. But here, space is really just used for the node itself. So depth is something that goes into the screen, so to say. So how do we visualize depth? One thing that we can see on this left example really is the labeling. It's really nicely done in this case, because the labels are inside a node, and you can, by looking at these labels, you can see where there are a lot of different labels being nested, so to say. That can give you an indication of depth. So the more labels you have, the more smaller labels you have, especially the deeper your tree, your branch is. Coloring is another one. You can use coloring to show different sub-branches, and then the tessellation inside really shows you how deep your tree is. So you could, for example, say, for each level you go down, you increase the darkness of a specific node, of a square, of a rectangle, and you distinguish different branches by coloring. And the third option to show depth is spacing. So the two examples on the left, what you really see is that here, for example, the higher actually depth of the tree is also indicated by the line thickness, as you can see. So the top level has thick lines, and then the lower level has thinner lines. So you would expect this to go on, to have thinner lines if you go into the tree. Um, Spacing is another way where you don't completely fill these gaps, but you leave a little gap, and it's pretty much like putting boxes into boxes, um, where you then can see, the more space you have, you can count the levels, right? So level 1, 2, 3, 4. So these nodes are in level 4, and here you can see this is level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these ones are on level 6. So this allows you again to make estimates. It's visually quite easy to figure out how deep these nodes are in this case. In any case, what is really important for in visualization, what is a general rule, um, small differences in line width, in color tone, hue, so to say, in transparency and brightness, in texture, really subtle changes that are barely visible to the eye can, if they apply to visualization, can make a huge difference. So if you look on the left, for example, the labels are barely visible. If you add, especially in these dark regions, if you add a tiny white outline around these labels, they suddenly become visible, right? Here, if you change every line for every consecutive level, just a little bit in thickness, it might be barely visible for the eye, but the whole picture, think of Gestalt laws, think of perception in general, your eye will understand these changes and understand the patterns of these changes. So here, for example, the darker areas, they mean there are a lot of lines going in. So the darker areas are probably um, deeper, right? Whereas here it's a lighter area, it's higher. And this is really when visualization work, and this is when visualization is successful. So if you're implementing your own visualization, or if you're taking a design that you have some control over, play with the visual appearances, transparency, color, line width, texture. Small differences can make huge differences in the visualization. Okay, back to our depth problem. Of course, we can also use interaction, as I've shown previously in this file browser example. So in a tree map, you could just click on any of these nodes, for example, and then opening it up. And the more often you click, the more deep you can go into your tree. So tree maps are really effective for visualizing lots of nodes, um, visualizing quantitative data on nodes, which you can encode as the size, for example, um, and visualizing color, so you can compare how different attributes play out in different branches. The problem with tree maps is comparing sizes of nodes. In the example of the left, the three colored regions, if I asked you the question which one is the largest one, you probably may have a hard time. The problem here really is that we can nicely compare if shapes, or let's say areas that have the same shape, are larger or smaller, like these two. But if the shape changes between this and this one, that makes it really hard for the eye to do. So this problem is really related to how do you create the divisions and subdivisions in tree maps. There are many different approaches, and there's a lot of literature of how to generate a good layout for tree maps. On the left one, for example, this is an approach that is called slice and dice, which I'm not going into detail here. But on the left side, we have nodes of different sizes because, for example, they have attributes or the number of children or something. And you kind of see specific artifacts. Here, for example, these nodes are really long. They're barely visible, actually. Um, so the shapes of these nodes here look very different. If all the nodes had the same size, the problem is still kind of the same. Of course, here you can see this. But really look at this layout and you understand there are artifacts visual artifacts that are introduced by the layout. This is again a common problem in visualization. It's the same problem in graph drawing, in if you visualize matrices, and these sort of things. So the algorithm can always introduce artifacts, and what you want is a layout that avoids artifacts. So for tree maps, for example, there is, as I said, many different algorithms. So here's one, it's called Squarified, that tries to make nodes as squared as possible. And you can see the artifacts are gone. Compare this again with this view, the barcode view, so to say. Here on the left, we can nicely see, oh yes, here are the bigger nodes. These ones are quite similar, and so on and so on. So we can nicely compare nodes. You get this slight artifacts that you start with the larger nodes on the top left for each branch, and then you go to the bottom right, which is in fact not as problematic because it shows you actually nicely when a new branch is starting. So you can see this one without playing with the line width, really, right? You see that this is one sub-branch, this is one sub-branch, this is one sub-branch, this is one, this is one, this is one, and so on and so on. And of course, recursively, you then reapply these things. Now, if all nodes had the same size, you end up with something like this, which, depending on the task you want to support, depending on your data set, might be less effective. So still, if there is yet another one which I want to show you, which is the Voronoi tessellation. Voronoi tessellation is inspired by cells and how cells are cells are assembled in living bodies, such as leaves, for example. So this is really inspired by leaves under the microscope. It uses a specific algorithm to most space efficiently assign these nodes, align these nodes into sub-branches. So we can see this is a sub-branch, right? Think of this as a large cell, or think of this as a large bubble, which is subdivided into smaller bubbles. And you can see these high-level branches here as these high-level structures, and the sub-branches here. Now, Voronoi tessellation is trying to solve further artifacts. For example, these very artifacts that can evolve, that can come from having a lot of parallel lines, which might be sometimes hard to detect, right? So if you look at this one, it is not suffering from these edge parallel lines, and it gives a nice, pleasant overview actually. So it has a lot of has caused a lot of future research into different types of layouts, for example, and it's quite efficient, a quite efficient technique. There are implementations in D3, for example. I invite you to look at this if you're interested. And to complete our review on implicit techniques, here's another one that some may call a Venn diagram, for example. They call it the bubble tree maps. The idea is still the same, that you're nesting trees. That you're nesting your nodes into each other. And it is kind of inspired by Voronoi diagrams and tree maps. So what we have here is nested sub-branches and the children, so to say. So each node here is really a bubble into sort of another bubble. The algorithm is a bit complicated. I'm not too sure if there's a version, a running version that can generate these bubble maps. What is good here, since nodes have all the same shape, a bit differently from Voronoi maps, so the shapes of nodes are not always the same here. But here, at least the leaves have all the same shape, which is circles. However, understanding of the depth might be a bit problematic. You have these kind of lines, which is good. So this is at the level 3. This is also at level 3. But if you go inside here, you need to watch a little bit more. But again, remember what I said. You could just play with line width, or you can kind of introduce specific shapes or um, shadings in the back to make the deeper nodes having a darker shading here in the background, and so on. It nicely becomes this kind of three-dimensional relief. So this is our the implicit tree relation, implicit tree representation. Now, if we think of the advantages and the disadvantages of the implicit trees and the explicit trees, so the implicit trees having the advantage that we can see nicely, it's an intuitive view, and we can see which nodes are um, connected and how deep they are, how deep the branches are, and the space filling approaches, then we can think, can we combine this into a hybrid technique? So elastic hierarchies was presented, was 15 years ago now, which is a hybrid technique between tree maps. So you can see and node link representations. You can see the root and the first level of nodes is represented in an explicit way, so lines. But then each of these nodes, B, C, D, which are in fact branches, are represented as a tree map. And then if you look at the one level, you go again, you use an explicit technique to link this to another tree map. So you're basically chaining tree maps. So you can encode node size, different attributes whatsoever in such a tree map. And for every level that you go down, which, as we discussed, is a bit tricky in tree maps and space filling approaches, you use an explicit representation. Now on the bottom we have a real-world example, such a elastic hierarchy. You can see some problems here as well. It might be quite complicated or complex view because it's always switching between tree maps and node-link diagrams. So you need to wrap your head around this technique, and you need to constantly think what is shown really. Now it can be a bit cluttered. There might be some optimizations for the layout to avoid these kind of overlaps, but it's an interesting technique that definitely values consideration. Now let's go back to a problem that I've already discussed earlier a little bit, which is the size of leaves. So in all of these techniques, implicit or explicit, the ones we have seen so far, the deeper your tree is, the more leaves you have, the smaller these leaves become. This is true for Voronoi maps, for Voronoi tree maps, this is true for tree maps, and this is true for node link diagrams to some extent, because you're running out of space to show all these these leaves and children, and in icicle plots as well, because at some point you're running out of pixels to fill your screen with. So what can you do if your leaves becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller? There has been an interesting technique, or let's say a different type of layout, because which are called polar layouts. So instead of having the node in the center, or on the top, as here in these icicle plots, or your node being your screen really, and then going to depth, the root node of your network is in the center, and each level in your tree is a ring. So naturally, this leaves you with more space for your leaf nodes, for your children, and for your leaf nodes. And there's almost no limit, because each time you go outside, you gain more space, because the circumference of your circle is getting longer. So on the left, we have an explicit node link diagram in polar coordinates, like in a polar layout. And the right side, we have sort of an icicle plot. It's an explicit representation. Excuse me, there's an implicit representation. Think of a wrapped icicle plot that is not shown vertically, horizontally, but that is bend together to form a circle, really. The technique is called sunburst and has been described now 20 years ago. Again, you can imagine a lot of interaction techniques. If you still need more space for your leave notes, on the here we have a small comic strip that illustrates how such an animation can work. If you click on a specific branch in your tree, or yeah, really branch, then this sub-branch gets replicated here outside of the sunburst representation, and then can extend again until, for example, it fills the entire circle. Now, what's also nice is we see this kind of leave node is making up 50% of, I don't know, some value that is encoded for each branch. And then if you click again, it will vanish again. So polar layouts are really efficient when you have a lot of children, a lot of leaves, because you have more space to show all these leaves. And still, it's kind of possible to see the deep branches. Of course, if you have very, very deep branches, your your circle may become a little bit unbalanced. So we have one last category of layouts, talking about layouts. So polar layouts and free layouts. In free layouts, this is kind of similar to tree maps, is where you have children